Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Inspiring Leadership podcast this week, and I'm delighted to have Mandy Hickson. Mandy has written a fabulous book called An Officer, Not a Gentleman. She was an RAF fast jet pilot on Tornadoes. She's a TEDx speaker, she's an author, and helps other people with speaking and training. But I've really enjoyed the conversations that we've had, and I am delighted to have her on the podcast. Mandy, welcome.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Lovely to be here.
Well, it's great. And the book is fascinating because it takes, and I recommend it to you all. As you know, I'm dyslexic, and Mandy's going to tell me a little bit about the dyslexic angle in her family. But therefore, listening to Mandy tell her own story on the audiobook is twice as good for me, and the upbringing and how life began. So Mandy, tell us about dyslexia in your family and what's quite special about that for you.
Yeah, so I'm married to Craig, who is really dyslexic. And then I have two sons, Jack and Jamie, who are both really dyslexic. My older one, particularly severely so, to the point when we got to about 7. And I suddenly realized that he really could not read or write at all. It was especially as my younger son was coming through, who wasn't quite as dyslexic, and he was sort of overtaking him and was reading books. And suddenly I realized just what an issue we had. And it was really only when we started getting all that testing done for Jack that Craig realized just that how his dyslexia had panned out as well, because his had never been formally diagnosed. Being a 63-year-old man now at school, it was never, as you know as well, Jonathan, that was never really brought up or actually highlighted. It was just, you felt thick, and that's how he had felt. And so it was only really when we had all that testing going on that he actually finally put those demons to bed and realized that he'd done so well to achieve all he had achieved, with this stigma of not being able to read or write as well.
Yeah, and we had another guest on the podcast, Jamie Waller, who's written a book called The Dyslexic Entrepreneur, and Jamie comes and trains here with me, and I coach him. And phenomenal guy, great friend of Richard Branson, goes on to Necker Island a few times with him, and also Kate Griggs is written a book called This Is Dyslexia. Which she sent me a copy of it, and she also runs a charity around dyslexia. She's really raised the profile of that, so I'm looking forward to getting her on. So it means a lot to us. So Mandy from Manchester, Spartan One, as you were known in the book. Tell us a bit about Mandy from Manchester.
Yeah, so grew up in the outskirts of Manchester in Sale. As my mum would say, it's Cheshire, darling. No, it's not. It's got a Manchester postcode. Come on, be real. I grew up in the 1970s there and went to state educated through and through. The grammar school system existed then, which was great. At the tender age of 13, I joined the Air Cadets on the first night that they opened their doors to girls. And then basically I flew while I was there, which sort of changed my direction somewhat. But I was always someone that was really sporty, really into my sports, county sort of netball, hockey, badminton, tennis, all of those things I absolutely loved. And I threw myself into every activity that school had to offer. I wasn't sort of a studious type, but I did work hard. But I also played very hard as well.
Yeah, and that's always, as we were brought up, you and I, in the forces, with this as an officer: work hard, play hard.
Yeah.
And I do think that those who had a successful military career, sport was quite an underpinning. I think the sport is a vehicle for teamwork and for competition. I mean, goodness, to become a Tornado pilot, the number of hurdles that you had to go through. And I was really taken by just, I thought when I was going through my selection as an army officer and then going to staff college, again, the selection gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but nothing like you went through to become a Tornado pilot. So many times there were hurdles that you could be failed at. And of course, your husband that you didn't mention, Craig, he was also a flying instructor. That's how you met. And we've got his Fleet Air Arm cap on the radiator behind you.
Oh yes,
And
yes.
have we got your hat?
On the other side. There you go. So we've
Yeah,
got the RAF one on
we've
one
got the
side.
RF in the other one. And so
On the other.
for those listening to the podcast, there's pictures of tornadoes and planes and outlines. So
Yeah.
it makes me very proud, particularly seeing my father's Fleet
Yeah,
Air
absolutely.
cap there. There's a bit of a connection. Um, and then he went on to fly commercial airlines as well, which is something you could have done. But I think we're all the more fortunate that you are now a motivational speaker to different people. And I think you've got so much to offer, particularly female empowerment in a very male dominated environment. You know, you only need to look at gentlemen's clubs in London who graciously have finally let a female, let females in. Well, you know, goodness me, so backward. And I think about how in my military service, the first females that we had, my first wife was one of the first female officers to come into a frontline unit, and that's how we met. So it really is groundbreaking. I think you were the second to become qualified as a Tornado pilot, but the cost, you have 5 years of training, £3.5 million.
I know, it's shocking, isn't it?
It,
When
it,
you look at it like that.
It's a huge amount of money. But and then when you're trying to give a talk to different businesses and you're saying, you know, this is my cost of speaking, oh, it's a lot of money. And you think, do you not realize how much to train a leader really costs? And many organizations really, oh, I'm not sure we want to spend that. You know, if they spend £25,000 on somebody over their career, they think that's an awful lot of money to train a leader. But many of them are thrown into roles. Do you have a particular view on that and what you've seen between the difference between the military and business?
Yeah, I think one thing I absolutely love, when you actually consider what we do in the military, we do it 180 degrees out from every single other organization in the world, don't we? Because we take someone at the start of their career and we give them leadership training, not management training, leadership training. And there is a really big difference. You know, we're not managing a process, we are inspiring others to follow. And so actually, if you're going to give people leadership training at the start of their career, it means that when they come out the other side, before they've even learnt the tools of their trade, they're already thinking about the fact that leadership is not a title, it's an action. And you can lead at the start of your career. That is really, really powerful. And so suddenly you've got a very different mindset about what leadership is. If you think about the normal business, you're going to start at the start of your career, you'll learn how to do the job. And then if you're really lucky, you might get sent on a 1 or 2 day leadership course. If you're lucky. I mean, let's look at, say, GPs, for example. They are in their GP practices and suddenly they find out now they've got to manage their own practice and suddenly they're stepping up to be the leader, the manager of their practice. They don't want it and they've had no training whatsoever. And so I think that that's something that the military has always done really, really well. And it's something I'm very, very proud of as well.
Yeah, it does remind me, you know, my brother finished his career as the president of British Plastic Surgeons. And it was, I think it might have been a bit of connection, but I'd written my book on inspiring leadership and sharing the stories of my blunders and mistakes and learning as a leader and the people I'd met, both in the military and then in moving into business. And he read that. And then I suddenly saw him go for leadership roles. Now, this is a man who played, you know, rugby for England, schoolboys, North of England against the Australians. He was very competitive, and he rowed for his university, and he was captain of boats, and he was stroke, which means he's determined and won't follow anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was sort of naturally in him, but I don't think he really had much development as a leader. But later in life, he became very inspirational to people. But as you say, it's often very late in the day, and I think they miss early talent to spot people because they haven't had the development.
I completely agree. In fact, my sister is, she's an incredible inspiration to myself. So she's a medical director of a hospice, palliative care consultant.
Wow.
And, you know, I mean, that is an incredible job. I don't know how she does it day in, day out. But then stepping up for that leadership role, it's been lovely seeing her develop as a leader without, as I say, all the same leadership training that I was gifted so early on in my career. And she takes on a very different role. So she's very holistic in her leadership styles. But as she's done more and more training, which she has brought into all of her hospice team, she has seen the team develop enormously. And just working out all those team dynamics and natural leaders, really encouraging people. What does empowerment truly look like? Not the telling, you know, asking and taking advice, you know, picking the people around you who are, you know, cleverer, brighter, you know, to make a really strong team. And you are the person just at the helm of that ship. And I think all of those really strong lessons I've seen her learning. But as you say, at this stage, so she is what now, 52. and has been doing that role for, I think, 5 years. But we were doing it when we were 21.
Yes, yes.
It's different.
It really does produce a cadre of very inspiring leaders, who I think businesses would be good to really tap into that. There's not many people in the forces now. I mean, there's
Yeah.
more sort of local councillors than there are people in the army. And there's only armies down at 70,000. What's the Royal Air Force at 35,000 or something? I don't know.
We
It
had
just
the
gets.
Army Navy Games at Twickenham the other day, and I looked around and I thought, yeah, we can't fill it anymore.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it gets smaller and smaller, and yet and it's a whole story in itself. When you look at Russia and the fact that it probably may win against Ukraine, and then who's next? Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland. Who knows what's next? We're on the brink of a very dangerous time. All the kind of stuff that's going on in the Middle East with Iranian Revolutionary Guards sort of training all these different forces to take people on. We've got a very unstable time, and yet they're shrinking the military more and more. And the best that a government can come up with goes, well, we might raise, GDP on defense to 2.5% in about 30 years' time. The next war will be begun by then. It's once again, we're not learning from history, but that's a whole story in itself. But you got into you were on the gates of suddenly we're gonna let women in. We're going to let women pilots in. And you were very good in the book. I really liked the balanced approach of it. You weren't ranting and raving, but as you read between the lines, there were a number of people, in fact, one in particular, who later on apologized to you, who was really just kind of an unpleasant bully to you because you were the female. And you had to jump through hurdles that were even higher, and the pressure and the loneliness of being the only female there. You got on with it because, of course, you're robust and you've been brought up with some good training and some good family beliefs by your folks. But tell us a bit about that, because it can't have been easy if you're really, really candid about it.
Yeah, and I think that is it. I've never been one to moan about that, and I'm really pleased that you pulled that out from the book, because what I did not want to produce in the book was a story of a poor me, because I was never that person. I absolutely loved my time in the Air Force, and I loved my frontline experience, and I love the camaraderie and the support that I got from 99% of the people. There was very few incidents really whereby I can actually put my hand on heart and say they meant that in an unpleasant way. They did that deliberately. There was a lot of microisms, well, and perhaps macroisms of sexism. But again, this was the lens of a different culture. And it was a different societal culture as well. And I think we can't put today's lens on a lens of 30 years ago. And I think that's something we have to really, really remember. And that's one thing I do say when I speak to people who have read my book, who are younger, and they say, has it changed? Yes, of course it has, but society's also changed. So, you're not going to walk into a room and it be 100% pornography on the walls. That wouldn't happen. But it wasn't just in the military. That was happening into garages. You'd go in and get your car serviced and be all the Pirelli's calendars of naked women. It was just a normalized behavior. And yes, it was lonely. And I think I say that a lot now when I do my speeches. If you're going to be the first, you're going to be the only. And it's a very lonely place to be. And that sort of really started to, to sort of hit home really, of just how hard it was at certain times. I think particularly my first tour of duty in Iraq, which was the year that I was bullied as well, because up to that moment I'd been surrounded by this incredible camaraderie of that training team, going through from literally the day we started officer training to the day I pinged out to the other side of the training system to go to fly on the squadron. I've been with the same guys, all men, a couple of girls as well, but predominantly men. And we were this incredible close-knit society and group, and they were my brothers, and they just saw me as being Mandy. They were the ones that supported me throughout, and it's fantastic. I think that's why it was such a huge differential when I got to the squadron. It was like, oh my goodness, they don't know me for being who I am. I'm going to have to prove myself.
Yeah, and I do love the part in your book where you have to learn these turns, and it's really difficult to turn with the aircraft, all turning in conjunction with each other. And the guys come and knock on your, Manny, come on, you're coming out. No, no, guys, I've got to study. I'm really got to get this into my head. No, come on, you're coming out. This is a bit strange. And they take you out and they give you a bicycle and you go out onto the parade square. And there is the rest of your course who are then going to do maneuvers with you. Okay, they're learning in it as well. But it was the guys were really mucking in and helping you out. And of course, you passed that really tough stage, which was a bit of a mental block for you because you remembered Valley and they doing these turns. I thought it was a lovely story.
It is a lovely story, actually, and there was a lovely icing on the cake on that. So one of those guys, and who was one of the ones that was pivotal in that, a guy called Puppy, Rob Kane, and he was the youngest, so he had boundless energy, and he was one of the guys that had taken me out, and he said to me just the last week, Mandy, are you ever doing any speeches in London that I can come and watch? And he came and he sat at the back on one last Monday, and it was just so lovely. And he was like, that's me that they're talking about. And it's really nice, that he's now doing coaching as well. And it's just that lovely circle of completion of, and one thing that really showed me, to be honest, Jonathan, was I think, we talk so much about diversity these days, don't we? But we focus, I think, on the wrong areas. I think we focus on cultural diversity and gender diversity and ticking the right boxes. But the cognitive diversity piece is the bit that we really are missing out on. And actually, having people within our teams that do think a little bit differently really does open up a whole different ball game. When you're in a railway track, and like I was at that stage, in a rut, doing something same way, same day, same results, you do something differently, you get a different mindset and you get a different outcome. And that's where that sort of diversity within teams really does play a huge part.
Yeah, I do love that. And there were a number of things as I jotted down reading through your book. Goose Bay, you came in and there was this horrendous situation with this runway, which was it's all icy in Goose Bay, and they put you onto the wrong runway, which in that weather condition was going to be very, and the whole skid where you saw aircraft all crashed that obviously had the same problem, but you lived it. But this idea of sharing mistakes and talking things through, and I think many organizations bury mistakes and they don't want to talk about it, and the culture doesn't encourage people to take the mask off and be human. I was coaching a leader the other day. We were having a walking meeting. I often do walking meetings with my CEOs. And I said, for me in my own journey, doing a thing called the Hoffman process allowed me to take off the masks of boarding school, army officer, all this kind of stuff, of trying to be perfect and to be vulnerable, not in a victim way, as you say. I never picked up in your book anything about a victim, not at all. Just the resilience and learning from it and the tough moments. But I think people in business feel they have to be perfect and without fault and never admit mistakes. I saw this occasion. Never admit a mistake. Don't ever tell them you made. No. And this is what the culture, even in a very proud organization like the Royal Air Force and certain squadrons or the Red Arrows, whatever it is, when the Red Arrows had a culture when it went bad, there was an arrogance, and someone was telling me because he knew them all, where they got a bit sloppy and they took pins out and things like that before they came in, and mistakes started to happen. But when you can admit mistakes and be human, it not only saves lives, but it's essential. What's your thoughts, Mandy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to mention this book at the end, but I'll mention it now, actually. A book that I really love is one called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Said. And I was working with Matthew, actually doing some speaking, and someone said, oh, he's got this book coming out. And I managed to get hold of a copy. And as I was reading it, it was just like, basically he'd done all of the investigation and documented some fantastic organizations who were talking openly about mistakes. And it was everything that I was talking about, but from a practical sense, from my time in the Air Force, and really seeing how culture had changed from the Air Force that I had joined in 1994 to the one that I left 17 years later. And culturally, I think when you look in those early days, there was a lot of blame culture. There was meant to be anonymity within reporting, but there wasn't really. And I know that people used to hide things, and this is a toxic culture. But that was what the aviation industry realized that they had a huge problem with in the early 1990s, when they saw automation improving massively, but the accident rate was going through the roof as well. And so that's when they recognized they had to actually develop something called human factors training, or crew resource management. And that became mandatory for every pilot to undertake that training, and cabin crew and engineers as well. And from that moment, when they did it so that it was an initial course at the start of a pilot's career, but then they made it mandatory to do yearly training as well, covering these 16 core areas over 3-year periods. And we saw the accident rate going down. And one of the big things they talk about is a just culture. And I'll give you the statement: a culture that recognizes that competent professionals make mistakes, and those same professionals will develop unhealthy norms in the form of routine rule violations, shortcuts, but there is zero tolerance for recklessness. So it's basically saying, here's my line in the sand. Anything to the left of that in the form of mistakes, slips, lapses, I just want to know about. But if you are reckless or there's sabotage, well, of course, there's going to be a punitive action placed on you. And I think that line in the sand is really, really defined. But once people had an idea about that, and people were seeing that the just culture was being adhered to, they started to talk openly about mistakes, because they realized that it was not something that they were going to be punished for, but it was a fantastic learning opportunity. And in the sessions that I run now, I talk about 300 events, because for every one major event that you will have, which for us within aviation is often a loss of a life, or if it's a big aircraft crash, a loss of many lives, there will be 30 near misses where you will get a report on them. But beneath your surface line of that iceberg, you're going to have 300 events that have gone unreported that people got away with. Now, if you never know what these 300 events are, you are always going to be reacting to the big event. But once we've got the data on the 300 events, we can start to be proactive, and then we have got a learning culture. And this mindset is something that I've been really developing with businesses. I can start a session, for example, with the police that I did not that long ago. And I said, who's made a really good mistake they want to talk about? And it was like this deathly silence, tumbleweed blowing, which is what I hoped it would be. And then, of course, we had the whole session about cultural change. And then I said, who's got a brilliant 300 event they want to share? I couldn't stop them talking. Of course, we were talking about mistakes, but it's how we were framing it in our mind to a brilliant learning opportunity. And literally for about an hour, people were just on their workshopping on the tables, writing all of these 300 events. And so sometimes it can be something as simple as that little bit of unlocking the way that we're thinking about something.
I absolutely love that, Mandy. I think it's a game changer, and people don't feel safe enough
Yeah,
to share about a mistake. I mean, my classic one I ask CEOs: question 1, when was the last time personally you were dead wrong?
yeah,
Question 2, how quickly did you realize you were wrong? And question 3, how quickly did you apologize and rectify it?
yeah.
The ones that worry me when they go, well, could have been 1974, but that wasn't really my But the ones I love, the CEOs who go, Jonathan, I've made about 5 today, and I made a bad call on someone I hired, and it took me too long to admit that it was a mistake. It was about 6 months before I realized that they just were not the person they claimed to be, with the right character and integrity, and I had to remove them, but that was expensive for the business. But that 300, it's going to stay with me for quite a long time. That the levels at which a big event happens, but then there's those ones that were near misses, as you say. But then the 300 that almost happened. I think of a friend of mine who was also a tornado pilot like you, and he had finished in the Royal Air Force, but he was with a team doing aerobatics, and it was a series of small things. He was running a bit late. He'd had a late night the night before, may have involved alcohol if it was Royal Air Force, but not normally before you fly. But everything was just a bit tight. And so he arrived a bit late, and he cut his corner a little bit on this. And then when he came in and landed, he had a terribly bad landing and almost crashed. Almost. And I just remember that word you used, just. The other word that you used, which I thought was very important, was because. Do you want to say why because was so important? Do you remember you mentioned it in your book?
I can't remember. What did I say?
No, I'm trying to think of it.
I'm
Um,
trying to
I
think.
think it was more you explaining about the importance of. It was linked to the just, but it
Yeah,
also was after you talked about the dark days of when you'd lost a number of friends,
yeah,
colleagues who had crashed and never came back,
yeah,
and I think of my mother telling me how they used to be on the married quarter patch, and they'd see a plume of smoke on the airfield,
yeah,
and they'd know it was one of their husbands, and how they wonder whose house the smartly dressed naval officer would go to and knock on the door.
yeah.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is. It's. I mean that chapter and that period where to help somebody plan a mission and then leave. And these guys that we helped, especially on that one trip up at Lossiemouth, to then hear that they haven't come back,
yeah,
and you're there thinking they're at the top of their game. They are as professional as it comes. If it can happen to them, it could happen to us.
yeah.
But you can't think like that in some ways. But it was the most disturbing and most upsetting day, I think, of my entire life. And in fact, I think it's coming up to their 25th. It's the 25th anniversary of their death, and actually they're putting together a memorial. And I thought of popping it into my calendar. Actually, it's in October, and I thought I want to go up there. And
I think you should. I think
yeah, absolutely, because I think it's just so important that we don't forget.
yeah.
It's not just in wartime that we lose people, but
No.
in training as well. So yeah,
And it is one of the things that differentiates those in the forces. It is maybe a bit like the police and the fire and some other professions. It's not often that you're asked to die for your job.
no,
Obviously, we didn't ask them to die, but they knew the risk, but yet they didn't know the risk. It was almost as if a bit like there's that fabulous book about RAF pilots in the Second World War called A Piece of Cake. It's a great listen. Get it, have a listen to it on one of your drives. But they were so young and so enthusiastic and didn't think it was going to happen to them. But
yeah,
yet, to so many of them, it did. Um, I think that's it's something where I constantly, when I meet someone who's in the armed forces, I say the American term, and it's not tried. I just say thank you for your service
yeah,
because
yeah. Me as
because you
well.
do. It is about serving to lead. Certainly, as an officer, that you have to serve others in order to lead them properly, and that concept isn't well understood.
Yeah,
But you flew in the no-fly zone over Iraq. You were keeping that no-fly zone going. And the book starts in a wonderful way. I won't ruin it, but I think that that whole experience must have, at the same time, it was a very tough time because you were very lonely because they didn't make you that welcome. It was a very, probably quite a macho, competitive environment. The testosterone was flowing around the place. But what was your learning about being in a high risk, really tough environment and your resilience because the pressure was relentless, wasn't it?
yeah, and I think it's a good question, really, because I think when I talk to a lot of civilian companies, and people always say, "We're not scared of being shot down." I was never fearful of being shot down. I was fearful of letting my team down. And that was a really interesting comparison when I look back, because I was only ever really worried about that. And when I look at some of the missions, and I think it was the mission that I started the book on, I say, I really earned my stripes that night, and I realized that I needed no longer to be fearful of letting my team down. I had led well, I'd done my job, and I could put my shoulders back and be really proud of what I'd achieved. And I think that whole feeling, though, of there were missions when we were flying, and I do remember one in particular when we were heading up to the much further north than we would normally go, beyond what's called the 33rd parallel. And we were designated to uh, destroy a target, which was a fiber optic center. And it was basically they're about to put all of their communications underground. And this was a high priority target. And when we turned north, it was like bonfire night. You know, if this is going out to America, that'll be the 4th of July, basically. It looked like fireworks. And my navigator said, Mandy, are your night vision goggles up or down? And I said, oh, they're up. And he goes, I'd leave it that way. Well, of course, as soon as someone says that, you can say, what? And I clicked them down. And I was looking and I thought, oh my God, it was just trace around and surface to air missile. Looked like they were being fired indiscriminately. And it was this weird feeling of we're going into that.
Yeah.
But in some ways, you know, actually not feeling invincible and indestructible, but at the same time, you're sort of feeling like you're removed from it because you're up at 20,000 feet and there is this feeling of they've got to be lucky to get me. Well, they were almost lucky a couple of times, actually, which made you feel a little bit more indispensable. But there we go. No, it was an interesting period.
Yeah, and also for all those of my military colleagues who, when we were living in squalid condition in a trench with awful sanitation and everything else that you do when you're a grunt, you go, oh well, those RAF boys, you know, they're having a great time in their 5-star hotels. Well,
oh no,
it's like, you know, it wasn't like that at all. You dreamt of going to the hotel, and once you managed to get to visit a hotel, you know, and see the pool. But there's a lovely part. You got some lovely humor in there as well. There was a lovely part where the special forces guys had been out, you know, giving forward air controlling for you. And some of the special forces guys, they occasionally get threatened by the grizzly bears, which want to come in and try and eat them. So they killed a couple of them, and it was flown in under some netting or something. And they call you up and they go, "Where do you want the grizzly bear? You know, where do you want your bears?" And you went, "What?" Well, and your lovely reply, "Well, where do you normally put the bears?" You said back to them. That was such a great.
I literally looked out the window and I saw this underslung load with these paws coming out. And I was like, what? That was the most crazy thing I think I'd ever seen. You know, where do you want your bear putting? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, dear. And then the other one, and being a man of a certain age now who can't make it through the night without getting up a few times, or when I'm on a long drive, that's all well and good. I can stop. But when you're a female you know, men can pee in a bottle, but women have to undress all the different layers, and it's just not at all an act of war. And just how acute it became. Obviously, you got very ill because of having to hold it in, as it were. But just people don't think about that kind of thing. You know, what do you do?
Yeah, that was agony actually. So yeah, and yeah, I'm happy to share. It's quite a funny story, really. So yeah, we were over Iraq, and you know, it was first trip in the morning, and so I'd always made sure you're hydrated because you have to be hydrated in case you get shot down. You don't want to be dehydrated to be starting the trip with. So we'd had a couple of cups of tea and a glass of water, and then all the guys relieve themselves right outside the jets, you know, sort of behind the shelters. But I can't because I've got all the kit on. So I'm already sort of an hour into wearing all my kit longer than all the guys. And then we get airborne. I thought, oh, I'm starting to need the toilet. And eventually I sort of said to my navigator, I think I'm going to have to go. And he said, okay, Mans, yeah, well, we are in a war zone. And I said, I know that. And he said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I think I'm going to have to strip down and wee in this bottle of water that I've got. And he said, well, have you got much space in there? I said, no. So I had to drink the water from the bottle, which made the whole thing 100 times worse, to create an empty bottle to then wee into the bottle. And then, of course, I had to put my seat pin in, my emergency ejection seat pin, which you would use, which would stop you from being able to pull the handle. But the navigator also had to put his in. So he's now going, okay, I'm in a war zone. What happens if we get shot at? I won't be able to eject. And I've now got to undress. Anyway, I managed to undress the whole thing with him calling all of the surface-to-air missiles that he was spotting on the radar homing and warning receiver, going, oh, there's a F-6 looking at us in our right 2 o'clock. I was like, can you not? I'm trying to relax and have a wee. Anyway, I failed, and I'd made the whole thing 100 times worse because I've now consumed a litre of water.
Yeah. Oh, and of course it became a medical.
Oh, it did. Yeah, it did become
You
a
became
problem.
quite ill from that. But
Yeah.
you know, a lovely humor that you can have in the middle of a war zone. And
Uh,
then what was that story? Two birds do it together in a tornado. Who is this in
uh,
your best mate?
Yeah, so this girl Helen turned up to the squadron, and it was the first time we had a woman to serve with. It was really exciting, and yeah, we got on well. We flew together in well at Marham, and we also flew together in Kuwait for a couple of trips. And yes, when we landed, we you know, we carried on and we never mentioned it to anyone. We actually only realized afterwards that history had been made, that, you know, 2 women had finally, you know, crewed a Tornado GR4 on the front line. And anyway, I was the author of the Mara Matters magazine. I had to put in the article every month to say what the squadron had been doing. So I sent off this article and no one ever read it. I was absolutely certain of that. So I thought, well, I'll catch people's attention by writing the headline of "Two birds do it together in a tornado." And I wrote the whole article, you know, 2 squadron had been this and that and the other. And then finally, the very last line just said, "Yes, and history has been made. 2 women have finally flown together in a tornado." And I thought nothing of it. I went off to the Gulf, and then she rang me while I was in the Gulf, and she hadn't yet. She said, "Who on earth would have written this horrific article with this headline?" And I said, that'll be me." And she said, "What? Why would you do that?" And I said, "I thought it was funny." And she said, "I've gone into the squadron and all the guys that have left have photocopied the article headline and have decorated the entirety of the junior crew room with the headline 'Two birds do it.'"
Oh no.
So she was furious with me about it, but it was
Yeah. Yeah. And well, it's lovely that humor, but also among the humor, there was also sad moment. You were trying to have a child,
yeah, yeah,
you and Craig, and you were unsuccessful on that. You lost your baby. Just, I mean, my mother lost her third child. It was before I was born, and had she not uh, had that miscarriage, I wouldn't be here.
yeah.
How that cool. But I can't imagine how tough that was for you.
Yeah, I think it was just the timing as well, really. So, I mean, I'd been on the squadron for 3 years and I was sort of about 30-ish. Yeah, I was 30 years old and I, I was, my husband's, 13 years older than me. So we were wanting to sort of try and start to have a family. And yeah, we've been trying and no success at all. So I just carried on flying. And then I hadn't realized that I was pregnant and carried on flying initially. And I was organising what was called the squadron's 90th anniversary. So 2 Squadron was the oldest fixed wing squadron. And so we were the first of all the squadrons to reach our 90th birthday. And it's known as Shiny 2 because every high ranking officer in the Air Force has served on 2 Squadron at some point. And so I was in charge of organising this. And unfortunately, on the Friday, with the celebration starting on the Saturday of Friday night was a big jazz night and hangar party, and there was a huge big sit-down dining in meal for 400 people, which we had an aircraft brought into the dining room. I had organised everything, and I miscarried on the Friday and didn't know I was pregnant. And talk about compartmentalising it, pulling it together, putting that in a box, going through all the formalities, organising the entirety of the weekend, and then finally on Sunday, when I got back home, I could go and do a lot of crying. But yeah, in some ways, I try to look at the positives. Then at least I knew I could get pregnant at that point. And so I've always been someone that's been really quite good at compartmentalizing things, which I think really helps if you are a pilot. And even now as a speaker, actually, I can have things going on in my life outside of the job, and there's nowhere in the world that the people in the audience will ever know that actually this is happening or that's happening. And actually, I think having that ability to compartmentalize has really held me in good stead, actually.
Yeah, I think it is when you're in some tough conditions. My wife can compartmentalize. She has this ability, Lee can focus in on something, and I'll be talking to her and she just won't hear anything. She's focused on doing that, whereas I'm a bit scatterbrained and I'll get distracted by things. But I think that then comes a time when it all catches up with you at some stage. Sometimes I've known people where they've stored stuff away for years, and then when it finally comes down, the whole thing can unravel quite badly. So it needs to be used with care and a skill, which I'm sure you've accumulated. I'm very interested in you're a TEDx speaker, and congratulations on that. That's no mean feat. And you love your motivational speaking. I can see why. What are some of the interesting lessons that you're trying to get across to people, and that they find most interesting in your audiences? Some of the themes on leadership with your
Yeah.
own stories.
So I sort of often start really by reflecting on my early journey to becoming a pilot and really bringing out those themes of resilience. But I do think resilience is a word that's overplayed a lot. Of we need to be more resilient. Children need to be more resilient. companies need to. And I think, what actually is resilience? Is it just the ability to bounce back? But I would say actually it's really linked into purpose. So having a clearly defined purpose. And I think for myself, when, people say, my goodness, you were so resilient, you hit knockback after knockback, everything from being told you are obese to failing all the tests to be a pilot to women not being allowed to be pilots. How did you keep going? Because I had a very clearly defined purpose. I knew what I wanted to do. So every time a barrier is put in your way, you will find an alternative solution to that. And you will take steps that are sometimes a sideward step, even thinking, oh my goodness, how is this going to work for me to get to the end goal? And worrying perhaps about it, but thinking it's something I need to take. And so there is all of that side of things as well. So there's that very much a feeling of resilience and purpose that I talk about. One of the areas I love talking about is this, what we were talking about earlier, actually, the cognitive diversity side of things, because I think when people look at me on the stage and go, oh, female fast jet pilot, it's going to be all around the women's rights. And it's not about that. I was a woman in a man's world. I did a job. You hear about the job, but the fact that I was a woman, it's not irrelevant, of course, but actually you're going to get even more lessons than you would perhaps if it was a male pilot standing and talking to you. But I think that whole feeling of the cognitive diversity about making sure that junior people within our teams have a voice, because when I'm speaking to some big businesses, and it's often apprentices who will be in the audience that will come up to me afterwards and say, I have seen so many better ways of doing things, but I just never felt empowered to speak up. And you have literally given me permission to do that, because I have said to them, that is your crux. The new people coming into your business are not emotionally attached to projects. They are probably thinking most rationally. They're seeing a project with new eyes. And actually, that's really exciting.
Yeah, I think this permission to speak up and to find your voice and to value different ways of thinking about a problem really does, certainly for those of us who are dyslexic, like your two sons and Craig, your husband. I wish, like Craig, I wish I'd known much earlier on, rather than work it out in about my 30s, that I wasn't thick and I wasn't going to be a dustman, but actually I just thought differently. But now the joy is it's my superpower. So being able to do this podcast with you, Mandy, and enjoying seeing patterns in things and being able to remember a whole load of titles of different books and, oh, you might need this. And that sort of crystallized intelligence, which comes later on. I just always thought I was going to be thick for years. I just thought everybody else was much smarter than me. I was just thick. And what's great now through the work that people like Kate Griggs and others are doing is that a lot of young boys and girls won't be made to feel that they're stupid.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they don't have to go through what Craig and I went through, and indeed that your two boys went through at different times, until you could make them feel that they were okay. There was nothing wrong with them. It's just that their way of looking at the world was different. What do you think?
I completely agree, and I see this all the time, and I think this has given me such a lovely insight into that cognitive diversity, because I think I will see something in one way, and literally Craig will go, I can't believe you're even thinking of it like that. Why don't you think of it like this? And it's often like completely diametrically opposed to myself, and I think, oh my gosh, that's actually really fascinating. And it's that was one of the reasons that stimulated to think about this book too that we're writing, is that whole feeling of coming at the same problem in a different approach. And I think, I do think it is fascinating, and I do think it's about making sure, therefore, that when we are talking to businesses, there is this psychologically safe space whereby people really do feel that their voice is not just heard, but more importantly, that it's actually actively listened to, and that it's valued. And and suddenly these apprentices that are, they are very tech savvy, they are social media gurus because they've intrinsically been brought up on it, and suddenly they're coming into businesses they're going, why on earth are you doing it like that? This is crazy, this is archaic. And I think it's lovely that we are encouraging those people to speak up.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. Well, look, since we've been talking about a couple of things that are dear to my heart in our Inspiring Leadership Campus, let's just do a quick fire questions, some quick thoughts and experience from all your service as a Tornado pilot, but now as a speaker. Darkest moment in your life and what it taught you, Mandy?
I would have said originally it was when the guys died on the squadron, but my darkest days probably would be more recently, actually, when my dad died. And he only died 18 months ago and with pulmonary fibrosis. And it was it was the most shocking, horrific experience I've ever been through. And I think it's that feeling when, to get a call when someone had told you that they had this illness, and, he's playing a round of golf and he sort of said, "Oh, I'm starting to struggle a bit, might go into the hospital." And to get a call to say, "I think Dad's, not too well," and me packing a bag with a ball dress because I was doing a black tie do, 3 business suits, and I just went up in my tracksuit because I literally had a speech every day that week, some in Copenhagen, London, and Manchester. And I literally had my clothes, my tracksuit, my leggings and my trainers on and all these smart clothes. And Dad went from being fine on the Saturday to dying on the Wednesday.
Wow.
And I was saying, "Dad, do you want me to come in my ball dress?" Because he said, "Well, I've got available." And he's like, "Yeah, if you could pop it, that'd be lovely." But it was seeing someone deteriorate so quickly who was completely of sound mind. And yeah, and how I processed that, really, because there was definitely a level of PTSD. It was my sister, as a palliative care consultant, said it was the worst death she'd ever witnessed in her 30 years as being a doctor. And that, for that to be your dad and to be holding his hand throughout the whole process, was horrific.
I can tell it still affects you now.
Yeah, it was awful. And yeah, and I had a speech. I cancelled 2 speeches, or cancelled all the speeches obviously that week, but I had a huge one that I was doing the week after, actually. And I remember it was at Silverstone, and they'd done the entire theme around fast jet flying, and they'd bought 1,000 copies of my book. There were 1,000 people. I was doing 3 speeches throughout the day, and I remember I turned up and I hadn't slept. It was exactly a week, and I'd been up all night thinking, "Oh, it's a week ago that he died," and I'd been crying. And I got to the event and I walked in. There's this fantastic guy who was the compere and the MC for the day, called Jez Rose, and I'd worked with Jez a few times, and he's just a really great character. And I walked in and he said, "Mandy, you're looking amazing." I went, "My dad's just died." And I went to burst into tears, and he said, "I've got a new puppy. Would you like to see some photos?" And he literally said, "And we'll discuss that later." And he pulled me out, and I looked at all his puppy photos. He filled me with positivity. I went on and delivered 3. Absolutely. I had people weeping in the audience. I had to be giving hugs to people. Jez said each speech got better and better. It was the same speech, but he said each one was different and got better and better. And he had to listen to all 3. And he said, and at the end of it, he said, "How are you feeling?" And I went, I thought, well, there's the compartmentalizing. But
Yeah.
and I held it together for the whole of that month, because I did have a speech every single day for the whole of November. And I got to a friend's house in Cambridge right at the end of the month, and it was almost 28 days after he died. And she said, "How are you doing?" And I literally just broke down. And that was the start of a week of sobbing for me. And it was almost like I've held it together while I had to, and now I'm going to release it. Like you just said earlier, you can compartmentalize it for a certain degree, but do give yourself a space. And I do that to say to people who, have been through a trauma or are bereaved to some degree, is to say, accept that you will need to actually process this at some point. You can't just park it.
No.
And the longer you park it for, the harder it will be. And actually, loads of my friends said, "Do you think you need counselling about it?" I said, "This is my counselling." Everyone I spoke to that week, I sobbed on, cried, and told them the awful story of my dad's death. And by the end of the week, I was actually fine. And genuinely, although I still am, it's very raw, I genuinely was okay about it. But it was a very interesting period, actually.
Yeah, I mean, interesting would be is like that Chinese curse. May live in interesting times. I think a really tough one, and my thoughts and my heart go out to you and your family, because there's never a good time for someone to die,
No.
and to go through what you went through, I can't imagine how tough that was. Um, let's go on the theme of health, moving from
Yeah.
those we've lost. What do you do for your health, Mandy? Because you were brought up in an environment where some nutty medic decided to tell you that you needed to lose weight because he hadn't got the right chart for working out what was, what was obese and what was not, and so gave you a complex right early on that you were too much weight. But so you were constantly making yourself almost emaciated to pass through it at 6 foot to some scales that they had. But what do you do now? You know, with all your public speaking, what do you do to look after your health and well-being, and what tips would you give others, I suppose?
So my husband is absolutely loves a routine. And so one thing that if we're both here, we every single morning it is a walk. No electronics, not allowed. You go out and it's at least half an hour, normally an hour and a half. We would go out and we'd just leave at 7 to be back by 8:30 and then on with the day. So I love walking. I've done Kilimanjaro, I've done Everest Base Camp. I did that with Craig last year. And Killy was with 20 girls, which was great fun. And so I love hiking and walking. I play tennis with a fantastic group of girls as well. So I do that twice a week. I go spinning. So if I'm ever not working, I will always always book a spinning class every single morning, and Pilates as well. So they tally together. They're always on the same morning. So I can do a back-to-back Pilates and then spin. And so, yeah, that will be my home routine. But the problem for myself is that obviously I'm away an awful lot. So what I make sure I always do now is I have my trainers in my bag. And so wherever I am in the world, I will always put my trainers on. I make sure I get up. If I've got a speech in the morning, I will go for a walk, and just makes you grounded. And it also just gives you that clarity of thought. And, as we would often say, when you're not trying to find the answer comes. And it's always when I'm walking, every
Yeah.
single time. It's my moment of clarity, of almost like that sort of, I wouldn't say spirituality, but of finding the space to actually think and breathe.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And of course, having had all those tours that you had with the Royal Air Force and being away a lot, now you're a public speaker and away a
And I
lot.
weigh an awful lot. I know, I think I'm weighing more now, actually. I think I've worked out I've had 12 full days at home since Christmas.
That is madness. Well, that's one of the reasons why when I get asked to speak a lot, I often turn them down. I much prefer the one-to-one coaching or being able to speak and do podcasts from home here. So
Yes.
I've got the two dogs there crashed out on
Yeah.
the sofa, and we can go and have our walk, or I can train in the gym, which is just next door in our garage. We've converted into a gym. But I think health and a routine is very important. And as you say, trainers in your bag. Well, Manny, there's so much more we could talk about, but I'm conscious of your time and the audience, and so let's wrap up with favorite book. I think you talked about black box thinking, that was one of them, and then your introducing yourself, and do your 2-minute top tip. So, what would be the favorite book that you'd recommend and why?
So I love in fact, Matthew Syed, I love both. Another book that he's written is Rebel Ideas,
Yeah,
which again ties really well into that cognitive diversity piece. We don't know what we don't know. So make sure that we've got the people in our team who think differently, think outside the box. And that was a lovely sequel as well to his book, which was Black Box Thinking. I also love Legacy, which was written by James, was it James Kerr, which was
yes,
all around
James
the
Kerr.
all around the All Blacks team.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that's a fantastic book. I love the cultural pieces within that, and the development of the team, and really, how he took them and became probably one of the world's greatest team at the time.
Yeah.
So that's a fantastic book as well. So yeah, they were probably my two favorite leadership style books that I
And I think wasn't one of their famous rules in Legacy was no dickheads.
yes, I know. It was so sort of Southern Hemisphere,
Yeah,
wasn't
I thought,
it? Just
wow, okay,
yeah,
so that
yeah,
one
fair enough.
okay. So, Manny, please introduce yourself. This is a standalone piece as well as within the podcast. Tell people what you did do before and what you're doing now, and share your top tip.
So I'm Mandy Hickson. I'm a former Royal Air Force fast jet pilot. I was the first woman to fly the Tornado GR4. I say GR4 because there was another person that flew the Tornado GR1 before me. And I served for 17 years. I left 12 years ago and became a keynote speaker, a coach, facilitator, author of An Officer Not a Gentleman, and a TEDx speaker as well. And I love the fact that I now travel all over the world. I've probably spoken to over 75 of the FTSE 100 companies currently. And, you know, it's been fantastic to be able to share my story. It started off speaking in schools, spoken to over 100,000 school children in all 5 continents now, which is something I'm incredibly proud of. And my top tip would be actually reflecting on something that was from another book, actually, by Sheryl Sandberg, Lean In. And she talks about the fact that life is no longer a career ladder, that it is more like a jungle gym. Now, occasionally you might find yourself whipping up that ladder with ease, but occasionally you might find yourselves crawling across, hanging onto some cargo netting and hoping not to fall into the ball pit below. But if you do, let yourself straggle in that ball pit, enjoy the freedom, and then enable yourself to get back on the ladder when the time is right for you. And I think that's it, when the time is right for you. And I think we all need to recognize that, you know what, sometimes it will be easy to focus on you. There are times when you need to be focusing on others, your family, you know, your career, you know, other things as opposed to your career. But don't berate yourselves for that. There will be a time and there will be a place. But if you find yourself in the ball pit, enjoy it.
Well, look, Mandy, it's been an absolute joy having you on. I can see why you're such a successful global speaker, and also why you're such a fine Royal Air Force fast jet pilot. And it means a lot to me, with a father who was a fast jet pilot and your husband who was too, to have you on this podcast. And I know people in 135 countries around the world will be listening to this and will value it very much. So those listening, please do spread the word, share this podcast with friends of yours, and please, if you like it, share that too. But Mandy, thank you for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me in, Jonathan.